Consciousness. Everyone understands it, but no one can explain it. Therein lies its mystery. Many scientists believe that our inner thoughts, feelings, voices are manufactured by brain functions, creating an illusion of consciousness. But some say that consciousness is a fundamental part of existence, something not found in computers, something of the mind, not in the brain. Defining consciousness can start to sound like word games, but consciousness studies is becoming a field of great promise, wrestling with the essence of what it means to be human. Next, on Closer to Truth, what is consciousness? Welcome to Closer to Truth. I'm Robert Kuhn. While you're watching this program, think about yourself watching. This is self-awareness, the interior mental experience we call consciousness. Is there something special about consciousness? We invited two philosophers, two physicists, and an anthropologist who is an expert on ESP to explain. Dr. John Searle is a leading philosopher of mind at the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. David Chalmers is co-director of the Center for Consciousness Studies at the University of Arizona. Dr. Marilyn Schlitz is director of research at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Dr. James Trefil is professor of physics at George Mason University. And Dr. Fred Alan Wolf is a physicist who writes about consciousness. John, you're one of the leading philosophers of mind. One of your recent books is The Mystery of Consciousness. Why is consciousness such a mystery?
Well, we don't know how to explain it. We're doing pretty well in physics, and we got some puzzling areas like quantum mechanics, but we do not have an adequate theory of how the brain causes conscious states, and we don't really have an adequate theory of how consciousness fits into the universe.
What are some of the traditional explanations? Don't critique them now. I'll let you do that later.
It's hard to resist critiquing them, but the standard view, the one that the man and the woman in the street believes, I think, is probably dualism, and that's the idea that in addition to the physical world, there's a separate mental world. There's a separate mental reality of consciousness that's not part of the ordinary physical world. Then, in opposition to that, I think the prevailing view among the professional experts, among psychologists and philosophers and neurobiologists, is materialism. And that's the idea that the material world is all there is, and consciousness either has to be reduced to brain states or computational states or something like that, or else it doesn't really exist at all. So the big choices today are between dualism that says we live in two worlds, a mental and a physical, and materialism that says, no, it's all material.
Zombies, Dave. What are zombies, and what do zombies have to do with consciousness?
Zombies don't exist. That's what's interesting about them. Zombies are hypothetical creatures. They're physically identical to you and me. They walk, and they talk, and they behave, and they're incredibly sophisticated, just like we are, but they're not conscious. They have no inner lives, no subjective experiences. These are strange, spooky beings. The interesting thing about zombies is that they don't exist. We're not zombies. That's what we want a science of consciousness to explain. Why aren't we zombies? Why are we conscious beings? Why did nature produce beings like us who don't just have this interesting physical structure, but have subjective inner lives?
Marilyn, you are research director at the Institute of Noetic Sciences and one of the leading parapsychology researchers. How does parapsychology reflect on the nature of consciousness?
I think that we can assume that there is a material basis to consciousness, and that all you'd have to do is take a sledgehammer and bang somebody over the head to see a reduction in consciousness. The question is, most cultures believe that we are also capable of transcending this physical, material aspect of our being, and to perhaps see our consciousness stretch or expand, stretch out into the world. And there's a lot of data from the parapsychological research that suggests that there is some non-local exchange of information between two people that, at the very least, stretches our definition of materialism, and at best then begins to support some kind of dualistic model that John mentioned before.
Not too happily, but we'll let him do that later. Jim, You're a physicist. You've written a book, Are We Unique?, about consciousness. Are we unique, and is consciousness part of that paradigm?
Yeah, I think it's possible to be a good 20th century materialist, to think that the brain is really a physical chemical system that operates according to known or at least knowable laws, and still think there's something different, something about it that cannot be reproduced by machines and has not been seen in animals.
Fred, you're also a physicist, trained in theoretical physics, and have written very extensively on the spiritual universe and the spiritual nature of the entire cosmos as well as human beings. So give us your reflection on consciousness and perhaps contrast that with Jim's.
I'll choose D, none of the above. The point I want to make is that possibly we're missing the boat by adopting a view that objectivity or materialism or any of the categories that we choose are correct. Possibly there's a third choice, or a choice which says that there's something beyond all of the materialists, all of the physical world that exists, out of which things project. Now, I take this point of view coming from quantum physics, that namely there is a ineffable realm, you want to call it a mystical realm, an imaginal realm, out of which the physical world pops into existence.
All right, let's get back to basics. So let's get some traditional characteristics of consciousness. John?
Well, the obvious one is the one that we all experience when we wake up in the morning, and that is there are these qualitative, subjective states of sentience or feeling or awareness. For every conscious state, there's something it feels like to be in that conscious state. So we know what it is to taste beer, and we know that it's different from feeling an itch, and that's different from smelling roses, and that's different from eating steak, and that's all different from thinking about mathematics. Now, all of those are conscious states. They all have this qualitative, subjective, inner character that they go on, and consciousness is what happens when you wake up in the morning from the dreamless sleep, and it continues throughout the day until you go to sleep again, or get hit on the head, or die, or otherwise become unconscious.
But doesn't that directly relate to states of the brain?
Yeah, of course. On my worldview, there isn't any question that consciousness is caused by brain processes. Anytime I have any doubts about that, all I got to do is take an aspirin or drink too much whiskey, and I detect the effect on my consciousness of changes in my brain.
Marilyn, does the fact that you drink too much alcohol and you feel a little dizzy, or you get hit in the back of the head and you see stars, does that affect the potential dualistic nature that you talked about?
I think we make certain assumptions, and right now, at this point in human history, in this culture, we have a materialist worldview that we live in. And so the questions that we ask about the nature of consciousness derive from that worldview. So we ask physical kinds of questions. It's possible that the physical nature of consciousness is very real, but that we need a broader definition of what is physical. If you look at the wisdom traditions, Buddhism, for example, it's a materialist model, but the definition of matter is much more encompassing than what we currently experience within our kind of physicalist model within Western science.
Dave, you like to talk about hard problems and easy problems. Tell us what those are.
There are a lot of different problems of consciousness. I mean, the word consciousness, I take it, doesn't mean one thing to all of us. Different people, when I'm talking about consciousness, I mean this. When you're talking about consciousness, you mean that. So there are different problems. Problem one is the problems of behavior. You know, how it is that we get around the world and we respond. I look at you and say, that's Robert. I'm talking about you. I can behave towards you and point to you.
And nicely.
And yeah, if you're having a good day. But that's what we might call relatively easy problems of consciousness. How is it that I can behave in this conscious way toward you? Now, the hard problems of consciousness are the problems of first-person subjective experience. While I'm doing all this, looking at you and talking to you, I'm having subjective experiences of you. It feels like something. I have visual images of you. I have thoughts about you running through my mind and so on. Maybe even a little bit of emotional affect. Why is all that going on? Why is there a first-person inner life at all? It's probably connected in some way to my brain. But why do my brain processes produce those subjective experiences? That's the hard problem.
Yeah, Dave, you see Jim over there?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he's generally a nice guy. But he wrote a book in which he said about you that if consciousness were a football game, you, Dave Chalmers, would forfeit right after the opening kickoff. Now, maybe he should have said rugby, but you get the point.
Jim said that?
I was about to say that right now. I think the point is that there's a standard saying in the sciences that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. Mm-hmm. And so when you want to say, as David does, that you have to create this new category of reality, which we'll call which is related to consciousness, or if you want to say there's this other kind of dimension or this other part to our world, the first thing I want to know is, well, okay, why am I forced to make that assumption? You know, and unless I see data that says, yes, there's no way you can do this, explain all the things we've been talking about here just on the basis of a physical mind, until I see the proof that I can't do that, then I'm not going to go and take that next step.
Well, I think the answer is that it's very clear you can't even explain physics without going beyond the material.
Well,
if we talk about quantum mechanics, we have to, we have to talk about a quantum wave function, something which is clearly not material, not substantive, and yet necessarily it has to exist in order to explain the simplest physical phenomena.
But at this point, isn't there a rather simple verbal shift that will get us at least to the point where we can address the same question, and that is the traditional categories of the mental and the physical, as they're used in popular speech and much of the sciences, are essentially 17th century categories.
Yes.
They're really out of date. What we're interested in is, how does the world work? Now, one of the things I think we know about the world is that consciousness exists. It's a real phenomenon in the real world, and it's a biological phenomenon caused by processes in the brain. Now, maybe you can cause it in some other kinds of systems. We don't know that yet, but certainly it's caused in the brain of us. And I was amazed that you seemed to be denying it of animals, Jim. I mean, there's any doubt my dog Ludwig is conscious. I mean,
so is my dog.
You can
compare dogs here? Yeah. No, but the point I was making at that stage was that my own particular, everybody has their own idea of how the brain is going to, this is going to turn out and how the brain will produce consciousness. Mine comes from the theory of complexity, things called emergent properties. I think consciousness actually is an emergent property of having lots of neurons stuck together, and dogs have fewer neurons than we do. And this is very much like what you said, John, that this is a 16th century concept. We have one word, consciousness, and it's got to describe everything, every possible collection of neurons. And we're just not equipped verbally to attack this problem.
Well, do you think there's a significant difference between human consciousness and whatever there exists of similar nature in non-human animals?
Yeah, I think so. I think at least you can make that argument. And I think that what I would say was that someplace along the line, the evolutionary track, you get to a certain complexity, and suddenly the properties of the system become different. And that's happened many times on the way to human beings, or to mammals, or to sea cucumbers.
There are all kinds of differences between human and animal consciousness, but the essential thing is the thing that Dave was pointing to and that I was mentioning, namely, they both have subjectivity. They both have these qualitative experiences. And that's what we're trying to explain, is how do these qualitative experiences fit into the rest of the universe? And I'm suggesting that the traditional categories are not the way to pose the question.
There's no question there's a really deep connection between the brain and consciousness. You duplicate my brain, in reality, you're going to duplicate my consciousness. You affect my brain, you get me some alcohol, you're going to affect my consciousness. But the real question is, what is the story about the brain explaining about consciousness? You tell a story about how the neurons interact in my brain, my visual cortex produces motor responses and so on. This will explain how I behave. This will explain how I talk to you and how I react and so on. And physical processes are really good for explaining physical structure and physical behavior. Once we get to consciousness, it seems we're dealing with a problem. It's no longer a problem about structure and about behavior of physical objects. It's about their sort of internal qualitative feel. And this is where it seems that the standard methods of physical explanation may well need to be explained.
Dave, do you believe in levels of consciousness? Is a mouse conscious, a fly, a virus, a piece of wood?
I think there are degrees of consciousness, and there are very different kinds of consciousness. We as humans have particularly complex consciousness articulated by our concepts and our language, and we're conscious of ourselves. Now, take a dog. A dog may well be conscious of the world around it, of food, of hunger, of fire hydrants, and other dogs may not be kind of conscious of itself in the same complex way. You go down to a fly. A fly is still kind of looking out at the world, and it may have some really simple kind of visual perceptual field. I don't see a reason to deny a simple kind of consciousness to a fly. And the further you go down, the degree of consciousness diminishes, the complexity diminishes, but it's very much an open question, I think.
Fred,
where it gives out.
How do you approach that?
I'm not sure if the degree of consciousness ever diminishes. I'm not even sure, that we are so super conscious ourselves. If I look at an anthill and I look at the activity of ants, I'm amazed at how human-like these simple creatures behave. So it's not to me... The real question is trying to define what we mean by consciousness. I think this is really a crucial point that scientists need to think about. How do we define it? What are the models we can use to really approach defining consciousness? I don't think materialism is going to work. I don't think pure subjectivity is going to work. But something that somehow encompasses the two has to be thought about. Quantum mechanics might be a place to look for starting, but it's not going to be the final answer.
I don't see the problem. You see, the definitions in science come in two kinds. There's the technical definition that you give at the end of the investigation, and we're nowhere near being able to do that. But there's the common sense definition where you just identify the target of the investigation, and that's rather easy. Consciousness consists of these subjective qualitative states. You pinch yourself, and you will have an altered state of consciousness. You feel a pain that you didn't feel before. Now, that's what we're trying to explain. Now, eventually, of course, if we had a perfect science of the brain, then we'd be able to get a scientific definition of consciousness. Like moving from the definition of water as a colorless, tasteless liquid to water as H2O. We're still in the colorless, tasteless liquid phase.
But will
that's no problem.
Will that complete definition obviate the need for consciousness as an entity, as some independent category?
No, not for me. I don't know about independent. But the point is, we want to be able to recognize that consciousness is a real feature of the real world. It's a biological phenomenon. It's real in the same sense as digestion or photosynthesis. Real biological phenomenon. We're not going to get rid of it or show that it didn't really exist or was all an illusion.
I want to
wonder
ask
if I could
Marilyn?
jump in here for a second and build on some of the ideas, because consciousness is a construct as much as it is a process. And as we begin to try and do science on something like consciousness, I think we need to recognize that Dave offered this kind of dichotomy between the first person and the third person perspective in consciousness. The notion that we have our subjectivity, that inner experience, we have that objective dimension that we can study using electrodes and PET scans and different kinds of physiological monitoring techniques. But there's also the second person perspective. That's the relational aspect of consciousness. And our concepts, our symbols, the meaning systems by which we can have this conversation are based on a shared set of cultural assumptions. And so I would suggest that there are data out there that suggests that consciousness is more than just the brain, or at least that the brain's capacities are more than what we've reduced them to, but that because our worldview, our Western scientific worldview, limits our assumptions, we would interpret those data with a particular set of filters, which may limit our ability to actually get closer to the truth about what is the nature of reality.
Well, of course, now you're introducing the interaction between two brains, which is, of course, going to be much more complex than the interaction within a single brain itself.
But I would argue you can't have consciousness without the multiplicity of beings from all levels of the evolutionary strata.
Well, maybe.
It seems to me you can have subjective states of awareness if you're Robinson Crusoe on a desert island.
Yeah.
That is, the point that I take it Dave was making, and I was trying to make the same point, is that the mode of existence of consciousness is a first-person mode of existence. Now, of course, you can't have a fully developed consciousness of the kind we have. You can't have language unless you interact with other consciousnesses. And you can't explain consciousness without appealing to the third-person fact that we have objectively existing brains in our skulls. But the actual existence of conscious states, the actual feeling of a pain or the taste of the beer, those have a first-person mode.
Are you equating that to gastric secretions in the stomach, both being the process of biological activity?
Yes, absolutely. That is, the point I'm making is maybe we can create consciousness artificially in some machine, but as far as we know to date, it only exists in human brains and in certain animal brains. And it's probably not worthwhile worrying about how far down it goes because we don't know how it works in our brain. So we're not ready to worry about why.
Do you agree on the bile secretion analogy?
The difference with stomachs, I guess, is you can tell a physical story about the stomach, and it'll make it transparently clear just why it is there are these gastric secretions there. You tell that physical story about the brain, how the neurons are hooked up to each other, or the areas are hooked up to each other, and you can say that produces consciousness, and probably it does. But does that explain why it produces consciousness? No, it seems to be kind of a further fact. It's an irreducible further fact that seems to be sort of tacked onto the story there somewhere. What we need in the science of consciousness is a theory of that connection between the brain processes and consciousness.
John, tell me about some of the people who would completely deny the existence of consciousness. What's their best argument? And I want you to be honest.
No, I have dealt with these guys for years, so I don't have any problem telling you their arguments. Their argument goes as follows.
I'm going to listen carefully.
Okay, here we go. As far as we know how the world works, it is entirely physical or material.
Okay.
Therefore, if we believe that there's something in addition to the physical or the material, some kind of touchy-feely, airy-fairy kind of stuff like Searle talks about, then it must be unscientific. There can't be anything like that. So it's an illusion, the idea that there's some consciousness in existence to physical reality, and it's an illusion generated by, and then follows your favorite theory. Nowadays, the favorite theory is by computer programs in our brain, but that's all there is really. Now, how about that? Was that honest enough? That's what my adversaries think.
That was honest.
That's what my adversaries think.
For much of the century, science has just been afraid of subjectivity, because science is meant to be objective, right? It's meant to be no subjective elements. But consciousness, by its very nature, is subjective. So some people think it follows from this by definition. Science can't touch consciousness.
It's always interesting to me how the latest brain theory just relates to the latest technology. It was a telephone exchange at the beginning of the century.
Right.
Then it moved into simple computers, then holograms. Remember the hologram theory of the brain? And then parallel computers, and now quantum physics. So isn't it just the latest theory in complexity theory?
Goes back all the way to the Greeks. The Greeks thought, the Greek thinkers thought that the brain was a kind of catapult.
But look, there's something very important here that we've left out. Even the notion of a subject is questionable. Take Buddhist concepts of consciousness. There is no subject.
I think we don't even know the questions to ask at this point in time. I think we're just at the beginnings of formulating some questions, let alone coming up with any answers about the nature of this great mystery.
John, do you think the interrelationship of religion and the wisdom traditions have a significant story to tell consciousness?
I'm open-minded. You know,
I've never heard you accuse that.
My theory is use any weapon you can lay your hand on, use any data that you can find. If you can get interesting data from mystics or swamis or people under drugs, that's fine by me. Just get all the weaponry you can. But I think when we solve this problem, we're going to have to solve it by examining actual biological mechanisms. You're going to have to get into the thalamocortical system and find out how these mechanisms work.
But once you do, and we're 100 years in the future, when we have a complete biological mechanism of consciousness, you are then satisfied that you will then be satisfied that consciousness is biologically explained.
Absolutely.
Well, Marilyn, you won't be.
Oh, I would say we need an integral research agenda where we acknowledge the physical dimensions that John's referring to and that Jim's referring to. But we also need to recognize that you can't have it in isolation from other people, so there's going to be that social, cultural context. And I also think there's very compelling data to suggest that there is a transpersonal dimension. You know, all these mystics and sages had something in terms of insight, and that ultimately we're going to have to accommodate these various perspectives.
You see, I think there's a lot of commonality here, but this is a fundamental disagreement.
Yeah. I don't think there's any out-of-brain consciousness.
And you do, Fred.
Well, I'm convinced that there is, mainly through traditions and mainly through what I've read, and also through some extraordinary experiences that I personally have had involved with shamans in various parts of the world.
Jim, you don't think so?
I'll keep an open mind on it, but right now I don't see why we need it.
Dave?
John said that consciousness is caused by the brain. Consciousness arises from the brain. But I think, nevertheless, cause and effect. We don't cause and effect are usually different things. So consciousness arises from the brain. I think consciousness is not reducible to the brain. We've got to keep these two separate domains interwoven, but nevertheless distinct in their fundamental natures.
Time for a summary question. Predictions. Fast forward 100 years. What has happened to consciousness? John?
Well, I think in 100 years, and I hope before 100 years, we are going to know how the brain does it. As we talk here, there are very competent people working on precisely this question. By what processes exactly do human and animal brains cause consciousness? And I think we're going to know the answer to that.
Marilyn?
We've figured out the limits of a strictly materialist model, and we've begun to embrace some of the expanded aspects of our being in such a way that we can really grapple with some of the serious social problems that we're facing today.
Jim?
Like John, I think we'll understand the brain in terms of neurons, and we'll understand how this phenomenon of consciousness arises from those neurons.
Fred, I hope you don't agree with these guys.
No, I don't entirely disagree with that. What we are going to understand in 100 years is possibly how consciousness creates brains and how brains arise from the absolute nothingness.
Dave?
I think we'll be closer to articulating a sort of fundamental principles, fundamental laws connecting physical processes and processes of conscious experience. When we have a simple set of fundamental principles, like the laws of physics here, then we'll have a theory of consciousness.
In the current scientific view, consciousness, our sense of self, emerges from all the complex electrical and chemical activities in our brains, like an atomic bomb emerges or explodes from a critical mass of uranium. But could consciousness be something more, never reducible to physical states of the brain, a fundamental attribute of human beings, an independent element of reality? Philosophers and physicists are disagreeing among themselves. For now, this divergence of opinion is what brings us closer to truth. I'm Robert Kuhn.
The companion book to Closer to Truth is available in bookstores or by calling 1-800-228-4630. Audio and video cassettes of this program are also available for home and institutional use. Pricing and ordering information can be obtained by calling the number on your screen. Please specify program number when ordering. To explore topics like these, join us online at www.closertotruth.com.